Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us this Friday for another sutta study. And this morning we have Aya Soma here at Empty Cloud Monastery, who will be sharing some verses from the Dhammapada with us, her own translation, TM. And good morning so far to Venerable Vimalanyani. Always good to see you online, as well as Gita, Nancy, Jens, Kumu, Amaranta, and Alexandra. And welcome as well to our viewers on Instagram Live and anyone who's silently watching without typing in to the live chat. So this morning, Ayasama will be sharing from her translation, but you can also follow along with Bhante Buddharakkhita's translation through the link in the live chat. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in as they occur to you, and we will bring them up at the end of the discussion. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Ayasama for this morning's sutta study.
Thank you, Bhante Sumana, and thank you all for joining us this morning. So we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namassami. So originally this morning, there was another sutta on the schedule, but I changed it last minute because I realized that actually Bhante Suttaso had already spoken about it a few weeks ago. So we didn't want to tire you with the same sort of sutta over and over again. But since the title of the subject rather of the sutta that initially I was planning on talking about this morning was Non-Judgement Day, I decided to take some verses instead of the Dhammapada and share them that are pretty much sort of along the same lines. So you will have Venerable Buddharakkhita's words in the link, so you can follow along. And since it's actually a very short part of the Dhammapada, we're not going to read the whole Dhammapada this morning, but just a little extract. We can read it first all in one shot, so you can also see the different wording that I chose in my translation compared to Venerable Buddharakkita. Contemplate it a few seconds, and then we'll talk about it together later. So the Dhammatthavagga begins with, one is not grounded in Dhamma if one draws conclusions arbitrarily. One who is wise would thoroughly investigate both good and bad. One who judges others not arbitrarily, but righteously and in accordance with Dhamma. A wise one, guarded by the Dhamma, is called one who is grounded in Dhamma. One is not wise just because one speaks much. One who enjoys peace, free from enmity, fearless, that one is called wise. One is not a master of the Dhamma just because one speaks much. The one who, having heard very little, sees the Dhamma directly. That one who is not negligent with the Dhamma surely is a master of the Dhamma. One is not an elder because one's head has gray hair. The one who has attained a mature age is called one who has decayed in vain. In whomever there is truth, righteousness, non-harming, restraint, and self-control, one who is stainless and wise, that one indeed is called an elder. Not by measure of their speech, nor by beauty of complexion, is a human being respectable if they're envious, selfish, and fraudulent. But the one who has these taints cut off, radically extirpated and removed, the one who is wise and has given up anger, that one is called respectable. One is not a renunciant just because one's head is shaven. If one speaks lies or is immoral, if one has given in to desire, how can one be a renunciant? One who knows evil actions, small or coarse, altogether. The one who has appeased all evil actions, that one is called the contemplative. One is not an alms mendicant just because one asks others for alms. Having accepted the entire Dhamma, one is an alms mendicant. One living the celibate life, having transcended both good and evil. One who walks about in the world with consideration, that one indeed is called an alms mendicant. Not by science is one a sage, if one is foolish and ignorant, but the one who is wise has evaluated and committed to the best. The sage who shuns evil deeds, that one is a sage. Whoever knows both worlds, that one is called a sage. One is not noble if one injures living beings. One who is non-harming all sentient beings, that one is called noble. Not merely by ceremonial observances, nor even great learning, not even by gaining samadhi, or by living alone. I attain the pleasure of renunciation, which is not shared by commoners, an alms mendicant who has arrived at confidence and reached the destruction of the taints. So we can contemplate the Dhamma for a few moments. And we can start discussing a little bit now. So if you've read Venerable Buddharakkhita's translation, you'll probably see that he's picked, especially at the very beginning, a lot more nuanced words than I have. So since I'm at the beginning of my translation, I like to keep it as literal as possible. It helps my understanding of the Dhamma. But also to understand also the nuances and compare it to other monastics who are ahead of me in the path and see why they have translated it in the way that they have translated it. And we see actually Celestino, I think it was, our Italian friend in the Dhamma, who I believe the other day was actually mentioning perhaps a little bit frustrated of how the Dhamma had all these different, the word Dhamma in Pali has so many different nuances of meaning. And I said, oh, actually, I love how the Dhamma has so many different nuances of meaning, until I started translating this, these verses. They got a little bit complicated. So then I decided to just leave Dhamma pretty much almost everywhere that is being used in the Pali, trying to kind of see if I could convey the same sort of meaning that the Pali is trying to use. And so in general, as Celestino was actually mentioning a few days ago, Dhamma can have both, obviously the meaning of the teachings of the Buddha, also the meaning of how things are, but also Dhamma is used as ideas, mental sort of phenomena, the norm of things, perhaps also sort of good practices, or what is under the sphere of morality and right behavior, and what is just. So we see, for example, the title Dhammatthavagga is normally, actually I think Venerable Buddharakkhita named it the just, correct? Yes, Bhattisumano says yes, approves. And I also believe he says, what I translated as one grounded in Dhamma, he translated one who is just. And fundamentally, that is the word Dhammatta, that literally means standing in Dhamma, and can also be used to mean someone who is a judge. But it's so beautiful, actually, to see this sort of double connotation of someone who normally judges, and we can see it in ourselves. How are we actually presenting our ideas or our criticism or our conclusion? How are we drawing conclusions in the world? Are we drawing them hastily, so quickly, arbitrarily, or are we pondering them? So the Buddha says here that one who is not grounded in Dhamma, so someone is not a judge, is not in the position to be capable of making statements, drawing conclusion on something that they're seeing ahead of them. If one is too quick in their assessment of the situation. So rather, what he's suggesting is that we should take the time to ponder what do we have in front of us. So investigating both the good and the bad, not stopping at the surface level, which is what we normally like to do. And we can be very quick at judging others, can't we? Right? We can have a very superficial evaluation based on our likes and dislikes. So I wanted to quote actually from the Anguttara Nikaya 4.3 how the Buddha describes one of these processes of quick evaluation. And he says, possessing these qualities, the foolish, incompetent, bad person, just so we know what he's talking about, maintains himself in a maimed and injured condition. They are blameworthy and subject to reproach by the wise, and they generate much demerit. What for? Without investigating and scrutinizing, they speak praise of one who deserves this praise. They speak dispraise of one who deserves praise. And without investigating and scrutinizing, they believe a matter that merits suspicion. Or without investigating and scrutinizing, they're suspicious about a matter that merits belief. Very important how he highlights, really, once again, the importance of taking the time to really assess the situation and understand where are we basing our this is good and this is bad, or this is a good person or this is an unwholesome person, or this is a good action and this is a bad action. Are we really doing the work to try and understand? So he says the foolish person does not do that, does not take the time and goes straight away in judgment mode. The other day when we were talking about, during the talk on the subject of bad karma, we were discussing how very quickly people can use this sort of statement. This person has bad karma. This group of people have bad karma. This nation has bad karma. We're saying how these days it's very common, unfortunately, in Buddhist circles to hear, oh, well, the Burmese people are reaping the fruits of their bad karma. Or perhaps female, if you're born a female, well, that's a bad karma, bad rebirth. If you are a person of color, that's bad rebirth. In a lot of Buddhist circles here in the West, I've heard that. Not really in the East, because that would be really surreal, right? None of them would say that. I don't think the Ajahns in Thailand think they had bad karma, being born in a Buddhist country. I don't think either, by the way. Or that the Buddha had bad karma, to be born as a person of color. But in the East, we can hear sometimes that being born a woman is bad karma. But when we see the scriptures, actually the Buddha, as we said, as we analyzed a couple of days ago, he's very adamant in saying quite the opposite, that all of these things, first of all, do not matter, whether it's genitals or whether it's color of the skin or all these physical sort of traits have nothing to do with, they don't have a good or bad sort of evaluation. They're just part of having a human body. And definitely, well, he doesn't speak about the Burmese, obviously, since I don't think Burma was even a nation back then. But what we were discussing the other day was that it's very important not to make these quick judgments like we know, but rather instead to see in the situation, for example, in Myanmar these days, instead of assuming what these people have done in the past and going about our delusions, perhaps we should just look at what is actually karma. So what is action? What is being done right now? And it's actually the military that is making bad karma. I wouldn't say that it's the Burmese people who are making bad karma. But what we know is that the military is making bad karma. And so that's what the Buddha encourages us to do, to really look what is in front of us and assess the situation, rather than going by all our hypotheses, all our misunderstandings of the Dhamma, all our ideas about the Dhamma. So in the original sutta that I was planning on talking about today, until I realized that Bhante Sudazo had spoken about it just a few weeks ago. So in the sutta where the Buddha is talking to Mikasala in Anguttara Nikaya 644, he says, do not be judgmental regarding people. Do not pass judgment on people. Those who pass judgment on people harm themselves. I alone or one like me may pass judgment on people. So this is an encouragement of the Buddha to humble ourselves, to not go, in pretending that we are the Christian God during the judgment day, but rather go into non-judgment day, which though does not mean not having an opinion at all, does not mean then, well, whether we're seeing something wholesome or unwholesome in front of us, then oh, well, it's all a matter of view, and then we fall into this relativism. That's not what the Buddha is encouraging to do, but rather what he's encouraging us to do is develop critical thinking and investigate what is in front of us. And ask ourselves the question, is this in accordance with Dhamma, or is it not? Is this wholesome, or is this unwholesome? So the action in front of us, not what, once again, we assume that the people in front of us have done in the past, or, whether we like them or not like them. But also not characterizing people either. So perhaps we're dealing with another practitioner and they have some wholesome qualities, but they also have some unwholesome qualities. So we tend to either characterize them in one way or the other. We can say, oh, this person is 100% great. So even when they're unskillful, then we can say, oh, but they're great in everything else. So they must be, excellent. Perhaps they're a great scholar. Perhaps their understanding of Dhamma is very good for the most part. But then they say some atrocious things. And based on the good things that they have shared in this world, then we characterize them with they're incredibly wholesome overall, or vice versa, because they've done or shared something pretty terrible and awful. Then we're like, well, this person is to toss away. They're completely, awful. And I'll offer in the Anguttara Nikaya 768 how the Buddha talks instead. And he says, the person who is practicing for his own welfare, but not for the welfare of others, is in that respect blameworthy. The person who is practicing for his own welfare and for the welfare of others is in that respect praiseworthy. So when I first read these verses, and by the way, they're very recurrent actually throughout the suttas, we see that he doesn't say, someone who's practicing for his own welfare, but not for the welfare of others, is blameworthy. But he says, in that respect, blameworthy. And similarly, if the person who is practicing for his own welfare and for the welfare of others is in that respect praiseworthy, not just praiseworthy, full stop. So in that respect is the key. So being able to discriminate and to judge the action rather than the individual, the single action or the single actions. And so we can cultivate the wisdom of saying, well, these actions, these qualities are wholesome, and these other qualities are unwholesome, and they can coexist in the same being. A lot of the, for example, scandals that we hear in Buddhism of these sometimes incredible teachers. Luckily, it doesn't happen that much in the Theravada tradition, but in the more precepts, less problems. But in other traditions where there's less precepts, they've had some problems. And it was actually very interesting to me once when I had no idea that, a master of one lineage that I was staying at this monastery had such a problematic conduct in the past. And I was at the beginning of my path, and I spent, a weekend just reading the books from this master, and I was like, oh wow, this master is incredible, clearly an enlightened being. Wow, so great. And then after 2 days, I'm talking with some of the residents, and they were expressing their distress of how this person in the past, he's actually dead, had committed quite, some unwholesome actions in the monastery. And I remember going, oh, shock. Wow. And this person is an awful being altogether. But I was like, but his Dhamma is also really good. How can these two things coexist? And so you'll have, either normally the people who are apologetics. So they're like, well, actually this master has done so many great things, opened so many monasteries. Perhaps we wouldn't even have Buddhism in the West if it weren't for this contribution. So he's great. Or, his actions are so horrible. He's burning in hell, and we should burn all his books and all his monasteries together with, everything else. So my understanding is actually that the Buddha is inviting us to be, once again, very discriminative in how we assess the situation, and acknowledge what is wholesome as wholesome and acknowledge what is unwholesome as unwholesome. And that's it, without creating, this big ordeal, big lengthy tribunal. And what I wanted to actually highlight in the Pali, so what has been, what I translated as arbitrarily, by the way, so one who draws conclusions arbitrarily or one who judges arbitrarily. The word arbitrarily, I found it very interesting that it has a connotation of violence. One of the synonyms was violence. And so very interesting how I love the Pali language. The more I translate, the more I become very excited. So we see in the second verse, when the Buddha says, one who judges others non-arbitrarily, it has that connotation of non-violently. So whenever we're too quick, we rush to too much, then we're actually being violent, which is against the Dhamma. But instead, what we do is to, once again, judge others righteously and in accordance with Dhamma. So justly, rightly, properly. And so he says, a wise one guarded by the Dhamma is called one who is grounded in Dhamma. And what came to mind when I was translating these words was the concept of a wheel-turning monarch. So fundamentally, what the Buddha would have fundamentally become, given his the wholesome qualities he had developed, had he not, attained awakening as a spiritual practitioner. And so we see the wheel-turning monarch is grounded in Dhamma, as someone who's extremely just, and which is why no politician is like that. Only a Buddha can be, or only who does not become a Buddha can become a wheel-turning monarch. So we have all these expectations also on our politicians, you know. We want all these wheel-turning monarchs, but in reality, they're all, you know, full of defilements. So very difficult for them to be capable of being grounded in the Dhamma, especially if they have no Dhamma. So very difficult to be just, to be righteous. I mean, if we see our own minds, then the minds of others can be a lot more relatable. You can have more compassion. And the Buddha continues, one is not wise just because one speaks much. One who enjoys peace, free from enmity, fearless, that is one who is called wise. So here the encouragement we see is not to focus on content, but rather, to focus on content instead of the container, which is normally what we like to, or where our attention sort of is drawn most immediately. So we like to listen to a lot of beautiful words, but what are the actions? Are these actually met? Are they following through what is being said? And the actions is basically the embodiment of the Dhamma. So once we get rid of greed, hatred, and delusion, then we become also fearless, without fear. And the Buddha continues, one is not a master of the Dhamma just because one speaks much. The one who, having heard very little, sees the Dhamma directly. That one who is not negligent with the Dhamma surely is master of the Dhamma. What I found very interesting is that the Pali that, what I used as to translate directly, so seeing the Dhamma directly, it's actually kayena, so by the body, with the body. So by their own effort. So not something that we've heard, not something that we've memorized, and that's why we speak a lot, but rather something that we really have understood, treasured for ourselves. So the Dhamma, once again, is something that invites us to come and see for ourselves, to practice for ourselves, not something that we just talk about to impress other monastics or other lay practitioners. And so and actually this is throughout the suttas, I don't have one particular sutta, but you can easily find it, how the Buddha very often encourages us to reflect deeply on the Dhamma. And even if we learn only one verse, but we truly master it, understand it, that's enough. And we see that there are whole traditions actually of Buddhism in Asia, of Asian Buddhism, that are founded pretty much on close the books. And they have only few words that are offered, that are shared with others. Actually, the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition that often we think is very, very simple practice, in reality is one of the most complicated practices, because we have so little of this sort of wording of Dhamma that is offered in those monasteries. So at the beginning, if we're very quick in our judgment, we can go, oh, this monastery is terrible. They they don't study. There's nothing, to do. Can have lots of bad and wholesome qualities coming in our mind, but that is a reflection of our mind rather than of the tradition. And when we really understand the tradition, we actually realize, at least I realize, that it's very advanced practice. So advanced that in this lifetime, I think it's not really good for me. I need more beginner stuff. So I need to really investigate the Dhamma. The more I have, the better. And here then we pass to another verse where the Buddha is inviting us actually to question how we use, certain words such as elder, so someone who is kind of older in years. Well, the Pali is teri, so someone, an elder monastic. And we tend to think of, someone who's an elder has gray hair, very old in age. But actually, I think for example, the one who is the most elder here at the monastery is one of the youngest. I'm one of the oldest, and I'm the youngest one. Well, not the youngest one, but younger, on the younger side. Right? So actually, Bhante Sudaso shared a few weeks ago one of the suttas where the Buddha expounds on this subject, so I won't go through it to that extent. But really, he makes a difference of what we think corresponds with wisdom. And we normally think that just decrepitude, just having a bunch of wrinkles and gray hair equates to being an elder, equates with wisdom. But the Buddha says instead, it's in whomever there is truth, righteousness, non-harming, restraint, and self-control. One who is stainless and wise, that one indeed is called an elder. So once again, what are the qualities of mind? Where are we in our development along the path? And so it has nothing to do with the outer appearance, nothing to do with the container, but everything to do with the content. So of course, the Buddha always likes to, turn our papancha, so all the random things that we use in the world to explain our existence in this arbitrary way, in this wrong way, in this wrong view. So all that papancha, he transforms it into patibana. Another great talk that Bhante Sudaso gave, the difference between papancha and patibana. Should go on our YouTube, PSA, if you haven't watched it yet. And then the Buddha says, not by measure of their speech, nor by beauty of complexion is a human being respectable if they're envious, selfish, and fraudulent. And so we see here, once again, what is being translated as respectable is the Pali of sadhurupo. Sadhurupo, there you go. That literally means good form. So we see there is a word play where we get very infatuated by forms such as nice speech, nice words that are picked. Perhaps if the speaker is good looking, then we're like, oh yeah, they're great. We listen to this speaker over and over again. And the Buddha says, toss all of that outside of the window. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. That's not a good form. That is not what we should respect. But what we should respect is the lack of envy, the lack of selfishness, the lack of being fraudulent. And if those are, in fact, present, then, that's not a good form. That's not something that is respectable. So we see also it's very interesting because, for example, beauty in the Buddhist teachings is the vipaka, so the result of good karma. But, removing envy, so not being envious, is something we do. And so this very much reminds me of the Sitta Sutta. What the Buddha says, by action one becomes a Brahmin. So we can say, one is a Brahmin, in terms of the social caste, by the product of deeds that they did in the past. So we can say that's the product of good karma. But what are they doing? right now. So right now, we don't care really about what one has done in the past, but what they're doing right now. Because by action, one is a Brahmin. And so we see how, once again, contemplating or ruminating or thinking about our own past deeds in previous lives that we don't remember, that have brought results in this life, or other people's past actions that have created a particular rebirth in this life, is completely useless. Because they could have done like the most incredible things in the past and have really good conditions right now. But if they're not acting skillfully, well, bad news that good vipaka, so the good results of the past karma, that good vipaka is impermanent. So it will disintegrate. And there you go, back into hell realms, back into really bad conditions in the future. And regardless, instead of, on the opposite, if someone thinks they have less than optimal favorable conditions, the important thing is to act in accordance with Dhamma, to act favorably, not to complain. That's a complete waste of time. Actually, as Venerable Dreamer, and I like to quote her from time to time, also said when she visited us a few years ago. It was quite great. She was like, probably going to butcher her quote, but anyway, paraphrasing it, it's like, when you complain, it's complete waste of time at best, and at worst, you're just advertising your own bad karma, you know? So why are you doing that? Just focus on making like wholesome actions, good actions. And by action, you're a fortunate one. The Buddha continues, but the one who has these taints cut off, radically extirpated and removed, the one who is wise and has given up anger, that one is called respectable. So once again, the encouragement is to remove always the unwholesome and cultivate the wholesome. And that is what is beautiful. And we all have the capability of doing that, regardless of our current situation. The Buddha says, one is not a renunciant just because one's head is shaven, if one speaks lies or is immoral. If one has given in to desire, how can one be a renunciant? And here, by renunciant, I translated samana. That is, the general word for contemplative. And what comes to mind is the sutta where the Buddha says, if all it took to remove the defilements, if all it took was to, become a monk, then we should just, wrap up all the little infants as soon as they're born. We should wrap them up in robes. And we would have a world of enlightened beings, wouldn't we? But instead, by action, one is a monk. So it doesn't matter if we look like ascetics, if we look like renunciants, if we look in a particular shape or form, if our actions are not matching what this sort of outfit symbolizes. One who knows evil actions, small or coarse altogether, the one who has appeased all evil actions, that one is called a renunciant. So in case we didn't get it, Buddha says it over and over again. We see the compassion of the Buddha, though. I love that. He says, has so many different nuances, so many different examples, so many different verses. We see how someone who has that compassionate heart and mind has inexhaustible patience to say fundamentally the same thing in so many different ways, with the hope that well, like maybe at the millionth time we hear it, we'll get it and we'll practice in accordance with Dhamma. And we see then, he continues, in fact, out of compassion, one is not an alms mendicant just because one asks other for alms. Having accepted the entire Dhamma, one is an alms mendicant. I love how he highlights accepting the entire Dhamma, so not picking or choosing. So not picking, okay, well, I like really to do, whatever, mindfulness practice, perhaps a little bit of concentration practice, but I don't know about that sila, that's boring. Remember, it reminds me too much about my Christian upbringing or whatever upbringing one has, so I'll toss that out. And definitely that rebirth sounds odd, so who cares? And there's actually really no karma, so all I want to do is mindfulness based the stress reduction, and then the consequences, of course, that there is no reduction of stress. There is just a temporary reduction of stress, and we have to deal with the crazy mind the rest of the time. So not picking or choosing is very important, whether we are monastics or lay people, but rather getting in entirely. He says, one living the celibate life, having transcended both good and evil, one who walks about in the world with consideration. That one indeed is called an alms mendicant. We see once again the consideration that brings us back to what we were saying at the beginning of this session. So in order to have consideration, one cannot be really quick at judging, but has to pay attention. What comes to mind also in this encouragement that the Buddha gives us, in particular, talking about alms mendicants, so bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, was, throughout the suttas, he says how we're actually, whenever we're eating food, to reflect that we're eating as debtors. So this is not something that is given to us just because we deserved it. We actually don't have a job, we don't have a wage, so we can only eat out of debt. And out of debt, thanks to the Buddha. So the Buddha encourages us to be the heirs of his Dhamma, not of his material wealth. Because the only time we will be able to pay back our student loans is when we will have eradicated all our defilements of mind, when we have, made all of this, made greed, hatred, and delusion, thrown it out, made it like a palm stump. So constantly developing sila, samadhi, and panya, the entire path. And the Buddha continues, not by science is one a sage if one is foolish and ignorant, but the one who is wise has evaluated and committed to the best. The sage who shuns evil deeds, that one is a sage. Whoever knows both worlds in this world, that one is called a sage. And I love how here, there is this sort of highlight on one of the characteristics, perhaps, that is very evident whenever we visit a monastery or whenever we meet monastics, that they're usually, more silent than the average person. And the monastery is usually more silent than the average sort of building or venue that we end up going to. And perhaps that's how we can think of ourselves when we get very much into, and now I'm a spiritual practitioner, and now I'm just, going to be like very silent here. And perhaps creating that persona of being the silent spiritual practitioner. But if our mind is still full of greed, hatred, and delusion, well, that's just an act that we are taking up. What is important is having that aspiration, cultivating right intention, and then making sure to make wholesome actions and not to make unwholesome actions. And this, we don't have to wait until enlightenment. We can do it in every single moment, which then will propel us to full enlightenment. So we see in the last verse, whoever knows both worlds, basically the Buddha is talking about both the human world and the non-human world. So one who has seen rebirth. So yeah, breaking news, rebirth is not optional. It's part of the whole Dhamma that we were talking about. And one sees it for themselves. It's not a matter of belief, but rather by practicing in this way, by cultivating Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, then it comes the point where we actually see it immediately. And that's when we can call ourselves a sage. And the Buddha just clarifies, just in case we didn't get it, one is not noble if one injures living beings. One is who is non-harming all sentient beings. That is one who's called noble. And it's so interesting, a lot of times we're like, why doesn't the Buddha just say one who is compassionate towards all sentient beings is one who is called noble? And I think actually because the Buddha is so very compassionate that he tells us actually the way that leads to compassion. So very difficult to have compassion right off the bat, right out of the bath, but right off the bat, I think is the English word I was trying to say. Right off the bat. The bat. Perhaps also out of the bath. But instead, if someone, is very irritating to us, or someone that's not particularly inspiring, or even like annoying creatures that we have to deal with, non-human creatures that are annoying the hell out of our existence. Cockroaches, for example. Very difficult to have compassion for them. But so much easier not to harm them. And the practice of non-harming is the practice that then will create inevitably the conditions for compassion to arise. So I find it so always beautiful that the Buddha, with one word, he covers all grounds. Doesn't take an hour Dhamma talk, 2 verses, that's it. And this passage ends with, not merely by ceremonial observances, nor even great learning, not even by gaining samadhi or by living alone. I attain the pleasure of renunciation, which is not shared by commoners, an alms mendicant who has arrived at confidence and reached the destruction of the taints. And so we see how the Buddha says, well, at the end talks about him, but before he talks about him, before he states his, current state of being, his quality of mind that is not shared by any commoner, but it's rather very special, is something noble. He talks about what we normally associate with renunciant life. All the perhaps religious trappings. Got quite a few, huh? Shaved head, robes. It's like got bhikkhuni ordination, also have an extra robe. Like so many different things. And we take precepts, we live in a monastery, we bow, there's Buddha statues, Bodhisattva statues, right? So we can get very much, that's the whole point of this all, is to be a religious, be part of the religious hierarchy. Or perhaps we're like, well, maybe that's not the entire path, but definitely great learning. If I memorize every single sutta in the Pali Canon, or every single commentary, or both, translate everything. Or perhaps actually I shouldn't do anything. I should close the book and just work on attaining samadhi, deep concentration, stilling the mind, that's it. Or maybe I should just live alone. Or maybe a combination of all these four, and that's all that has to be done. And actually, all of these things need to be done. Well, we don't necessarily need to translate all the Pali Canon and the commentaries. But point being, all of these things are wholesome and useful, but they are a means to an end and should not be taken as the end itself. Because there is a higher meaning, of the, like what the Buddha talks, the pleasure of renunciation, which is something that we can both, take in the ordinary sense. So something that we can also see whenever we let go a little bit, as Ajahn Chah says, we get a little bit of peace. And we let go a lot, we get a lot of peace. And when we let go completely, we get complete peace. So we can get, now that we're at the beginning perhaps of the path, we can have, the pleasure, we can find the pleasure of renunciation here and there. And like, I let go of a little bit, that's great. For example, when I ordained and I got rid of all my clothing and of my hair, wow, and I stopped like shampooing, wow, I was like, I got a little bit of peace. I don't have to think about, where is the shampoo for fine hair that doesn't like dry out the hair. It doesn't, that was just like a little bit of peace right here and there, Didn't have to practice that much. It was just like shaving this off. Or, there's an important monk coming. What should I wear? Oh, I wear this. Oh, there's a not important monk coming. What should I wear? Oh, I wear this. I have to go to town. What do I wear? I wear this. Do I stay in the monastery? What do I wear? I wear this. A little bit of peace here. Great. I don't have to think about what is appropriate in terms of clothing anymore. So there's that pleasure of renunciation. And then there is what the Buddha is talking about here. The higher meaning of the pleasure of renunciation is when we have renounced everything. All the defilements have gone. So complete nibbana. Isn't it incredible how actually we have to renounce greed, hatred, and delusion? It's just like means that we're so attached to greed, hatred, and delusion. Like, my little greed and my little hatred and my little delusion. Let's go to bed together. I love you. But we then relinquish them and we have complete peace. And we see has arrived at confidence, so at complete faith. Why is that so? It's not because the Buddha has seen it for himself. It's not something that he believes in, that someone told him, but rather he has seen it for himself. But very important to also recollect that for ourselves. We don't have to wait until the end of the path. Whenever we practice in accordance with Dhamma, we can see exactly what the Buddha says in this moment here and now. And that is what builds faith. Which then will be, will be true faith when we enter stream entry. Because all the lingering doubt, that we're attached to, we'll be able to relinquish that because we see the inevitability of this path in the sense that whenever we practice these instructions that the Buddha has given us, it's inevitable to get those results. All right, so I think we've, that's the end of this morning. We have 5 minutes. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to bring them forward.
Anamayang Dhammakataya sadhu karang dadamase. Sadhu, 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 anumodami. questions at this time, feel free to type them in, and I'll raise them with Ayasoma. Much gratitude again for sharing those wonderful words of Dhamma with us. And good morning to all friends who joined in during the talk. There were several questions about Kamma, but since the talk isn't about Kamma, maybe they could be saved
Monk chat this evening.
So join us at 7:30 p.m. New York City time if you can, right here on our channel for a panel of 3 monastics, one of whom I assume will be our guest, Tan Nisabo.
Yeah, after all the teasers on social media that you've seen his pictures, now you're going to see him live.
And Celestino says, Sadhu, my experience about not judging others comes from evaluating in samadhi the truth about forgiving myself. Now I cannot judge others or myself for things done in the past, but instead see ignorance as the real guilty factor.
Sure, but also, like, if you see an unwholesome action, it's very important to identify it as unwholesome. And if you see a wholesome action, to identify it as wholesome. So not getting into, the pitfall of, oh yeah, well, I don't judge anyone. That's just like the spiritual persona that we create for ourselves. And then when we read the sutta, sometimes, whenever we find what the Buddha shocking, I think it's very telling of our misunderstandings of what spiritual practice is, of what it means to be a holy being. The Buddha can be very direct and actually can use very strong language. Actually, as we were sharing earlier, foolish, stupid, incompetent, bad person. That's like some really strong language. But definitely in this country, maybe in Italy, no. I know Celestino's from Italy, so maybe that's like okay in Italy. But here, if I turned around and said, oh, you're being a foolish, incompetent, bad person, if I said that to Drew, I think Anagarika Drew wouldn't be quite happy about it. He's saying, okay, that's all right. But point being, it's very important to understand why the Buddha is saying that, and that the Buddha is saying that out of compassion. And he's also saying that because he's telling it like it is, because it's important to highlight an unwholesome behavior.
Thank you. And that seems to be the only other comment / question, perhaps, of the morning so far. At least online. Michael says, just as we try to give up the view that there is indeed a me, is it best to remind ourselves that we judge an action, not a person?
Yes, that's what is very skillful to do. It's my understanding anyway of the Dhamma, of looking at the action rather than the person. So yeah, I think your understanding is correct.
All right. Well, it seems like that's the final question of this morning's sutta study anyway. But again, not there either. Yeah. But again, if you have time and energy, please join us tonight at 7:30 p.m. New York City time for Monk Chat, where you can bring up questions again about this morning's sutta, any of our talks this week so far, or anything else related to Buddhist practice. So take advantage of your opportunity to have live Q&A with 3 Buddhist monks. So we can end the 3 sadhus.
Yeah, you can never do
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Enjoy the rest of your day.